Welcome back to Dial M for Miami, Season 1, Cracks in the Foundation, the Sergio Pino Story, a true crime podcast produced by Herdat Media and hosted by me, Anna Quincoces. Episode 4, Indefensible. Today, we venture into the mind of Sergio Pino, a man whose life was a perplexing tapestry of contradictions. To the world, he was a charming, successful businessman, a philanthropist, and a devoted son and brother. But beneath this veneer of respectability lay a darker truth. This is a story of a man who believed he could get away with anything, even murder. In this episode, we'll explore the personality traits that drove him, his need for control, and the brutal lengths he went to in order to maintain his dominance. We'll also delve into his acts of kindness and generosity and ask the question, were these genuine or simply another facet of his manipulative nature? During my research for this podcast, I spoke with a lot of people connected in some way to Pino. Many described him as a narcissist. I was not surprised. Some level of narcissism is present in many successful people. As a society, we just love to throw around the word narcissist. I've done it myself. We've all done it, be it an ex, a boss, a business associate, or even a parent. Many successful people do exhibit what some might call healthy narcissism, characterized by high self-confidence, assertiveness, and a willingness to take risks. These traits can be advantageous in competitive environments. But there's a significant difference between that and NPD, narcissistic personality disorder. In order to really explore Sergio's behavior and try to begin to understand his complex psyche, I met with a mental health professional who specializes in NPD and asked him to review the case of Sergio Pino. He explained to me that the difference between being a narcissist and having NPD or narcissistic personality disorder lies in the intensity, the pervasiveness, and the impact of the traits on a person's life and relationships. While many successful people do exhibit some narcissistic traits, such as confidence, ambition, and a desire for recognition, these traits do not necessarily indicate a disorder. Narcissistic personality disorder, however, includes traits like pathological grandiosity, which is an exaggerated sense of self-importance and a need to be seen as superior. A need for excessive admiration. Their self-esteem is dependent on constant external validation, and they require excessive admiration and are hypersensitive to criticism. Lack of empathy. People with NPD have difficulty understanding or caring about the feelings and needs of others. They often exploit relationships to meet their own needs, showing little regard for the impact on others. And then entitlement and exploitation. They believe they deserve special treatment. Their behavior is inflexible and persistent across various contexts. From the beginning, Sergio Pino built his empire by playing by his own rules. Whether it was bending regulations in his construction business or skirting the edges of legality in his dealings, he seemed to thrive on taking risks that others wouldn't dare. This audacious approach earned him a reputation as a man who could make things happen. He was known to grease the wheels of bureaucracy with a well-timed donation or favor, always staying just within the boundaries of what was legally permissible, or at least what could be proven. Yet his rule-breaking didn't stop at business. In his personal life, Sergio's need to control and dominate extended to everyone around him, especially his wife Tatiana. As their marriage began to unravel, Sergio's behavior escalated from controlling to criminal. He placed tracking devices on her car, staged robberies at her home, and as we've previously discussed, repeatedly attempted to poison her to death. His belief that he was untouchable wasn't just arrogance. It was the defining characteristic of his personality. He truly believed that he could rewrite the rules of right and wrong to suit his own needs. Despite his ruthless behavior, Sergio Pino was also known for his philanthropy. To many, this side of him seemed almost contradictory. He donated millions to local hospitals, funded scholarships, and was a major supporter of various community initiatives. One of his most notable acts of generosity was a $2 million donation to Florida International University made in honor of his father. The donation was a surprise, and the ceremony held in his father's name was a grand affair. It was attended by prominent community members, politicians, university officials, and the media. During the ceremony, Sergio spoke about his father with apparent affection and pride, describing him as his greatest inspiration and a man of integrity who had shaped his life. The gesture seemed genuine, almost heartfelt, as his father stood beside him, visibly moved by his son's words and the unexpected honor. But for those who knew Sergio only through his public persona, this was the side of him they recognized: the generous, loving son who wanted to give back to the community. But was this generosity truly selfless? To answer this question, we have to consider the nature of narcissism. Narcissists often engage in what's known as grandiose behavior, public displays of generosity or kindness that are designed to elicit admiration and praise. It's not about the act itself, but about the perception of the act. Sergio's $2 million donation may have been as much about bolstering his own image and feeding his need for adulation as it was about honoring his father.
Narcissists often use philanthropy and grand gestures to reinforce their self-image as powerful or important, even benevolent. It's not that they can't feel affection or achievement, but their motivations are primarily self-serving. They want to be admired. They want to be seen as exceptional. This can make it very difficult to discern whether their actions are truly altruistic or simply another form of manipulation.
In Sergio's case, his philanthropy seemed to serve multiple purposes. It bolstered his public image, provided him with the admiration he craved, and allowed him to maintain control over how he was perceived. By appearing generous and kind-hearted, he could more easily deflect attention from his darker actions. This duality in his behavior made it difficult for those around him to reconcile the image of the generous philanthropist with the man who was willing to go to such extreme lengths to control his wife. This brings us to an important question, and one that I can only assume haunts those who spent their lives showing love for this complex man. Can a narcissist like Sergio Pino feel genuine love? The love he expressed for his father during the FIU ceremony seemed real. There were moments when his affection appeared authentic, where it seemed like he was more than just the sum of his darker impulses. However, as our psychologists explain, the nature of narcissist love is fundamentally different from what most people experience. It's conditional. It's based on how other people make them feel or how they reflect on them. Narcissists often view those around them as extensions of themselves, tools to be used for their own gratification. So while they might experience attachment and even assume affection, these emotions are deeply intertwined with their need for control and admiration.
Narcissists can feel attachment and affection, but their version of love is often more about possession and control, more so than genuine emotion. They are capable of intense feelings, but these feelings are usually centered around how the person they love enhances their own self-image. If that person no longer serves this function, the love can turn to indifference or even hatred very quickly.
Sergio's relationship with his father may have been one of the few genuine emotional connections in his life. His love for his father seemed the most sincere of all. After all, his father had little to offer him at this point in his life, but he always recalled the sacrifices his dad made for him and his brother and held him in very high esteem. Nancy has testified that right before Sergio took his life, he gave her an envelope of money so that she would make sure all of his father's medical bills were paid. But even that was likely viewed through the lens of how it made him feel about himself. His love was real, but it was conditional and self-referential. The inability to form truly selfless bonds is a hallmark of narcissistic personality disorder, and one that made Sergio's behavior even more dangerous. His affairs with the wives of powerful men could very well have been driven by this grandiosity, his need for validation, his lack of empathy, and desire for control. These actions likely reinforced his belief in his own superiority and fed into his narcissistic need to prove that he was above the rules and constraints that govern others. Did he ever truly care for any of these women? According to our experts, it is highly unlikely. For Sergio, control was everything. His generosity, his love, and his philanthropy were all tools he used to manipulate those around him. When Tatiana didn't accept what he thought was a generous $20 million settlement, his need for control became all-consuming. He escalated from emotional manipulation to outright violence. One particularly chilling example of his manipulative behavior occurred when he staged attacks on himself to gain sympathy and deflect suspicion. As we know, he set fire to his own car and even staged a shooting at his property, all in an effort to create a narrative where he was the victim. These actions weren't just about deflecting suspicion. They were about maintaining control over the story and over how others perceived him.
Narcissists often use manipulation as a tool to maintain control. They will remind you of the good things they've done, not because they truly care, but because they see these actions as transactions. They believe you owe them something in return. This sense of entitlement is a key component of their personality, and when they feel that control slipping away, their behavior can become very dangerous.
Sergio's need for control and his sense of entitlement were not just aspects of his personality. They were the driving forces behind his increasingly violent behavior. His manipulation wasn't just about getting his way. It was about asserting his dominance, about reminding everyone, including Tatiana, that he was in control. As his world began to crumble, so did Sergio's grip on reality. His behavior became more reckless, more erratic, and more dangerous. Even as the FBI closed in on him, even as he knew he was being watched, he continued to plot, to manipulate, and to try to kill his wife. This wasn't just the behavior of a desperate man. It was the behavior of someone who truly believed he would never get caught. Narcissists typically have an inflated sense of self-importance and a deep need for admiration, which makes them more resistant to showing vulnerability and admitting failure. However, when faced with a complete unraveling of their constructed identity, financial ruin, legal troubles, public humiliation, or exposure to their true self, some narcissists may perceive their situation as a catastrophic loss of control and self-worth.
When narcissists begin to lose control, their behavior can escalate dramatically. They are no longer just trying to protect their self-image. They are trying to regain control over their environment, over the people in their lives. This need for control can push them to extremes, leading to actions that seem irrational or even insane to outside observers. But to the narcissist, these actions make perfect sense. They are doing whatever it takes to maintain their dominance. And while it's not common for narcissists to commit suicide, it can happen under extreme circumstances, especially when they face a total collapse of their carefully curated persona.
In Sergio's case, the combination of financial pressure, the FBI investigation, the potential loss of his empire, and the threat of public disgrace could have created a situation where he felt trapped, with no way to preserve his image. For a narcissist, this perceived annihilation of their identity and power can lead to suicidal thoughts or actions as a final attempt to regain control or avoid the unbearable shame and loss of status. This scenario suggests that even though narcissists are generally driven to preserve their image at all costs, extreme pressure and the realization they can no longer control their narrative might push them to take drastic measures, including suicide.
The decision to commit suicide in a person with NPD is often less about depression or self-loathing and more about avoiding an unbearable loss of self-image and control. For Sergio, the ultimate loss of control and status might have been too much to bear, possibly contributing to his decision to take his own life. Suicide is not very common among individuals with narcissistic personality disorder, as they typically strive to maintain their self-image and control over their lives. However, there are circumstances under which a narcissist might consider or commit suicide. Those being loss of control or status, perceived annihilation, and in this case particularly, avoidance of consequences. If a narcissist is facing severe legal consequences, public scandal, or a situation they perceive to be as inescapable, they may choose suicide as a way to regain some sense of control or to avoid facing said consequences.
The traits of narcissistic personality disorder are quite severe and not ones that would elicit the sympathy of the jury. I was still curious if NPD is used as a defense in trial.
The use of NPD as a legal defense is generally less effective due to the nature of the disorder, which is associated with the lack of empathy and manipulative behavior. It can be difficult to convince a jury that someone with NPD deserves leniency.
Sergio's meticulous planning didn't stop with his business dealings or personal affairs. It extended even to his own funeral. Now, it might seem unusual for someone to leave such detailed instructions for their final farewell, from the guest list to the menu to the very clothes he would be buried in. But this obsessive control is not just a quirk of a micromanager, it's actually a classic hallmark of narcissistic personality disorder. Sergio Pino's final farewell was as meticulously curated as the life he led. He had two funerals, a traditional viewing at a funeral home, followed by an exclusive invitation-only gathering at his brother's home. True to his specific instructions, the event was held outdoors, under the sweltering Miami heat, where his body lay in an open casket, dressed casually in a polo shirt, shorts, and a red cap. Ice was discreetly placed beneath the casket, a futile attempt to stave off further decomposition. The guest list was tightly controlled, and attendees were required to surrender their phones into a basket upon arrival, ensuring the event remained very private. One by one, guests were permitted to approach the casket, while the nostalgic melodies of Willie Chirino played in the background, and Cuban delicacies were served, evoking the essence of the life Sergio Pino had so carefully crafted. In attendance were his first wife, Nancy, and their eldest daughter, paying their respects to a man they had known intimately. Conspicuously absent, however, were Tatiana and her two daughters, perhaps a silent testament to the fractured legacy he left behind. Pino had an insatiable need to control his narrative and how he was perceived by others. Even after death, Sergio wanted to ensure he was still the center of attention, still admired and respected. It wasn't just about planning a funeral. It was about cementing his legacy, dictating his final chapter, so that in the end, he would still have the last word. While we can't definitively diagnose Sergio posthumously, the patterns are unmistakable. His behavior wasn't just reckless or desperate. It was the embodiment of a man who believed he was invincible, a man whose need for control and admiration knew no bounds. His story forces us to question, was he a mastermind, always a step ahead? Or was he simply a deeply flawed individual, driven by a psychological disorder that made him believe he could never lose? After my meeting with the psychologist, I received this note providing his final assessment. It reads, After thoroughly reviewing the extensive details of Sergio Pino's behavior, both in his personal and professional life, it is my professional opinion that he exhibited a pattern of traits and actions consistent with narcissistic personality disorder. His grandiose sense of self-importance, profound need for admiration, and a pervasive lack of empathy for others are hallmarks of this disorder. The calculated and often reckless behaviors he engaged in, such as his affairs with the spouses of powerful men, his elaborate efforts to harm his wife, and his meticulous control over his own posthumous image, suggest a deeply entrenched personality disorder that drove him to extreme measures to maintain his self-perceived superiority and control. While it is impossible to diagnose him definitively without direct clinical evaluation, the evidence strongly indicates that NPD played a significant role in his life and ultimate downfall. Which brings us to the ultimate irony. Despite all of Sergio's efforts to control every aspect of his life and death, in the end, he couldn't control the narrative. His story instead became a cautionary tale about the destructive power of unchecked narcissism. Ultimately, Sergio's life was a study in contrasts, a man who could be generous and ruthless, loving and terrifying. His acts of kindness and philanthropy were often overshadowed by his need for control and his willingness to destroy anyone who threatened it. Was he a narcissist? Almost certainly, but he was also a lot more. Next week, we'll explore Sergio's legacy and the power struggle that has erupted among the remaining Pinos now that the once unshakable patriarch is gone. What does succession look like in the wake of his downfall? And how are Tatiana and her girls finding their way out of the rubble now that the foundation has crumbled beneath them? It's a battle for control, a fight for survival, and a quest to rebuild a life shattered by betrayal. Join me as we continue to explore the life and death of Sergio Pino. This has been Dial M for Miami, a true crime podcast produced by Herdat Media. If you enjoyed this episode, please don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review. Thank you for joining me. I'm Anna Quincoces. I'd like my audience to be aware that the content of this podcast is for entertainment and informational purposes only. The opinions expressed by the host and guests are solely their own and do not reflect the opinions of any organizations or individuals referenced. All individuals mentioned in this podcast are considered innocent until proven guilty. While we make every effort to ensure the accuracy of the information presented, we cannot guarantee that all details are accurate or up to date. Any errors or omissions are unintentional. This podcast does not intend to defame or harm the reputation of any individual, and any statements made should be interpreted in the context of public commentary and storytelling.
A Herdat Media Production.